Hello and welcome to the Consistency Project podcast. My name is Patrick Cummings. As always, I'm here with E.C. Synkowski. Every week on the show, we aim to simplify the science of nutrition, health, and fitness, cutting through the noise to focus on the principles and practices that will help you perform better, feel better, and live better. Thank you so much for tuning into the show. Hello, how are you, E.C.? I'm
good. I'm ready to end some more fear-mongering in the nutrition space.
I am excited for that as well. We're going to talk about anti-nutrients, and we're going to explore the surprising roles of lectins, oxalates, phytates, goitrogens, and phytoestrogens. I'm pretty sure we're doing this whole episode just to test me to see if I can pronounce those things. And we're going to answer the question, are they harmful or could they actually be beneficial? So maybe a little bit of background for folks who don't know any of those words. I'm raising my hand right now. What are we talking about and why is it important?
Yeah, I think we touched on this briefly in maybe our older paleo podcast when we kind of did that diet review. But anti-nutrients are kind of a lot of the reason why certain diets like paleo, but even more extreme diets like carnivore, you'll often hear them recommending against certain foods, specifically certain plant foods. Mm-hmm. And so when we look at plant foods, yeah, they contain the macronutrients like protein and carb and fiber and maybe a little bit of fat like we talk about. But they'll also contain the micronutrients, the vitamins and minerals. And we focus on those a lot here because those are really the nutrients that we have an essential need for. But plant foods have thousands of bioactive compounds. Bioactive meaning they have an effect on our tissues, on our cells. So they have this bioactive effect, but they don't have an essential role in the body, meaning we can live without them. And we talked about some of these bioactive compounds called phytochemicals, particularly in the podcast we did specifically on the Mediterranean diet. These phytochemicals are compounds like curcumin and turmeric and lutein and spinach, and there's thousands and thousands of more that we believe they have these health-promoting properties about them. And really the magic of all of these phytochemicals is that there's probably a synergistic effect where thousands and thousands of these molecules come together in these whole plant foods to promote health more than necessarily any single one, like more than the curcumin and turmeric. It's all of the compounds most likely in turmeric that have this effect. But of course, research is ongoing in that area. But there are a subset of these bioactive molecules in plants that have been dubbed anti-nutrients. Now, some of them are phytochemicals and some of them are just anti-nutrients. But the reason that they've been dubbed anti-nutrients is because they might interfere with, let's say, the absorption of nutrients, or they might affect how normal function occurs. Maybe they affect gut function, right? And ultimately, I think this term anti-nutrient is likely a misnomer because I think oftentimes they're going to have more benefit than they have risk when we kind of look at the full picture. If I'm maybe giving away the punchline a little early here.
All right, so I've already listed them. I'll do it one more time. Lectins, oxalates, phytates, goitrogens, and phytoestrogens. Let's do the first one first. What are lectins?
Lectins.
I feel like of the list, this is the only ones I've heard of before.
Oh, really? Okay, you've heard of lectins, yeah. This is definitely part of kind of the paleo diet dogma, yes. So lectins are proteins that bind to carbohydrates, and they're found in most all organisms. And plants will use lectins as a defense mechanism. That's true of a lot of these compounds. These, and specifically these lectins, can help kind of like paralyze or poison predators. And so then the concern is, well, is this happening to us when we eat these plants? Now, there are lectins in fruits and vegetables, but we often focus on lectins in beans and grains because they contain a much higher concentration of lectins. And you'll hear about kind of bean and wheat lectins, and they're abbreviated as PHA and WGA for the long biochemical term. And that's what's gotten a lot of attention, I would say, in kind of the blogosphere as well as the research. Now, what's interesting, I think, about even within grains and beans is that there's still a wide variety of concentrations in those lectins. They're going to range based on even the maturity of the plant, like is it just starting to grow or is it kind of at the time when you would harvest the plant, as well as what variety are you talking about. Like there's lots of different types of wheat plants, and then even the location where it's grown is all going to affect what lectin content these legumes or beans have. Now, the problem with lectins in the diet is that they can be resistant to digestion in the GI tract, and so ultimately this is where they have this potential anti-nutrient function is that they could bind to our cells in the GI tract, altering their function. Not good if we ultimately want to digest and absorb our food, right? Now, here's the good news. Soaking, boiling, heating, cooking reduces the lectin content. Like boiling legumes for an hour reduces the lectin content upwards of 99%. And that's how you buy legumes when they're kind of already in a can at the store. They've been pressure cooked already, right? And then if you buy raw lentils, you have to soak them for a while and then you cook them for hours. And all of that is going to help reduce the lectin content. And bread, of course, like that's been cooked. And even oatmeal that you buy has been cooked largely to reduce the food pathogens, but that's also then reducing the lectins that you would get in it.
Interesting. So where does all of the fear come from for lectins? Because again, that's what I've heard about lectins is that we should avoid them. They're dangerous. So where does that come from?
Well, there is a real risk, especially if you were to consume kind of raw or undercooked beans, for example. Typically, it's severe GI upset, and there's definitely been cases of this. Nausea, vomiting, severe diarrhea, all of that stuff. I haven't found as much evidence about the raw or undercooked wheat gluten or wheat lectins, but it's like who's eating raw flour, where maybe you can imagine a scenario if somebody was preparing lentils or something, they might not have been cooked quite as much or to the degree, right? Now, the fear, though, comes from there have been cell studies that show an increase in an inflammation response when these cells are exposed to like wheat gluten. So it's like taking, rat cells and just dosing them in wheat gluten, and then we find that they have an increase in inflammatory response. And so this is what gets taken out of context in kind of our online media. It's this broad sweeping claim that, lectins increase inflammation, and inflammation then causes disease, and it just becomes this really broad statement from a very small scope study. And so what we have to do, instead of like worrying about what happens to isolated rat spleen cells that were doused with wheat gluten, is we have to take that step back and be like, okay, well, what happens to humans when they eat the prepared food as it should in a diet with more foods than isolated wheat gluten? And that's a lot of where kind of the miscommunication and the fear-mongering in the science occurs, is people will cite these cell studies and they just really aren't relevant to what we're exposed to and how we actually interact with that compound. And so I don't want to say these cell studies are irrelevant. They're certainly great from like a science point of view of testing small hypotheses and learning about systems and maybe then understanding a bigger system. But they are irrelevant in the sense of, should people be making diet choices based on these? And the answer there is no. And so when we do take that step back and we look at what happens to humans who eat these foods, not just like douse our individual cells with wheat gluten, we find that inflammation and health risk decreases. So the Zoo 2018 paper in the show notes find that a whole grain diet reduces systemic inflammation, similar to, I'm not going to get the name right, but Hagashemi 2019 paper in the show notes, inflammation decreases. And then looking at disease risk, the WHO 2023 paper in the show notes find that whole grains is associated with a reduced risk of heart disease and a reduced risk of death. And the Gasser 2020 paper in the show notes finds a reduced risk of cancer with whole grain intake, including colon cancer. So, if wheat gluten was causing all of this inflammation, we would see that the inflammatory markers go up in those two studies, but they don't, that I mentioned, they go down. And we would also see then the risk of disease and death go up, and we don't, as I mentioned, the two studies, they go down. And then I've also linked 3 studies in the show notes that say the same thing for beans. Inflammation goes down and the risk of death and disease goes down with consumption. And here's what's something that's like super interesting. And I think we're going to see this kind of theme throughout some of these other anti-nutrients, is they're actually looking at lectins potentially from a cancer diagnostic and therapeutic point of view. Because of this binding property of lectins, they're looking at their ability to identify cancer cells, and they've also found in cell studies that the lectins help prevent proliferation, which is the problem with cancer. It keeps growing. So these lectins have been shown to stop that proliferation activity. Now, of course, it's a cell study. More research needs to be done. But it's just an interesting kind of flip of the coin here, where we're so worried about this compound, but yet we're also now researching it from a beneficial point of view. And again, once we look at it in a whole diet, we don't find that there's any risks. And in fact, it's better off that we include them in our diet.
Super interesting. Okay, let's jump into oxalates. What are they? What are the concerns? around their consumption.
Oxalates. Ooh, man. These definitely have become more popular because of the carnivore contingent. I was going to say crazies. Let's say contingent. So oxalates in plant foods, no surprise, they're high, very high in things like spinach and Swiss chard and beet greens, but even some beets and sweet potatoes. Now, like lectins, the concentration of oxalates are going to vary by the type of food as well as where it's grown, and also things like cooking can reduce the oxalate consumption. So very similar there in terms of lectins. Now, only 5 to 15% of the oxalate that you eat, 5 to 15% of the dietary oxalate is absorbed. So the rest is going to be eliminated in your stool, and it just binds to calcium in the GI tract, and then it kind of goes out the back door. And it also turns out that there's certain microbiota that you have in the large intestine that degrade oxalates, such that this is why, let's say that you eat, 100 grams of oxalate, you're not going to actually absorb 100 grams. You're going to absorb a much smaller amount. It's also important to know that oxalates are made naturally by the body. So the diet may really only be responsible for half of the oxalate that you find in your body, where our body is making oxalate by way of just natural, normal metabolism. Now, there's a couple concerns with these oxalates. The more mainstream one is that binding property I mentioned, that it can bind to calcium in the GI tract, so that could prevent nutrient absorption. Like maybe it's reducing the amount of calcium that you would absorb, and so therefore we might be at a higher risk for something like, let's say, osteoporosis. But then in the cases where it is absorbed, that molecule still has that binding tendency, and so maybe it could lead to something like kidney stone formation. And so those are the big concerns. Like, this thing is so likely to bind to things. What is it doing to the nutrients in our GI tract, but then also in the body? I'd say the less mainstream fear, although it's becoming more popular, is again coming from the carnivore community. And that is this fear that's called oxalate dumping. And it's this made up phenomenon that oxalates accumulate in your tissues. And that's, again, from the plant foods that people eat. But then this accumulation is suddenly released because once you go carnivore, you cut out oxalates in the diet. And so your body is, quote, dumping all of these accumulated oxalates in your body with the switch to carnivore. And they often will use this oxalate dumping idea as sort of a catch-all to explain very vague symptoms of fatigue and joint pain and digestive issues. And I've anecdotally seen carnivore diet practitioners kind of blaming how terrible they feel on oxalate dumping for like months. They'll be like, well, I switched 5 months ago, but I just feel terrible from all the oxalates. And it's like, no, you feel terrible because you haven't had a vegetable in 5 months, but I digress.
I actually do. Now that you just talked through it, I do remember you did a post on Instagram about oxalate dumping. That just triggered my memory. Okay, so those are the two fears. What does the science actually say about those or others?
Yeah, I mean, I think we can start with the second one first. I think you all know, can sense already that oxalate dumping is not an issue. And this is what's so frustrating about junk science is you can totally make up an issue, make it sound scientific, and it takes so much work to discredit the claim. We actually talked about this in the creatine episode a while back. It's called Brandolini's Law. And it's like this internet adage that the effort to debunk BS is an order of magnitude higher than the effort it took to create it, which is so true. Like, there's nothing in PubMed that talks about oxalate dumping when you switch to a carnivore diet. Like, nothing, nothing. And it's hard to debunk stuff that's made up because, I was thinking about it, like, how do you debunk whether unicorns exist besides saying they don't? It's like, it's really hard to do. Okay, the reality about oxalate dumping is that they're dumped, we can put dumped in quotes here, meaning excreted daily via the urine. Now, I guess I should say for completeness, there are some oxalate disorders. One would be an inherited genetic disorder that's very rare, and another could be the byproduct of having another GI disorder like IBD. But the overwhelming majority of people do not need to worry about oxalate dumping from like discontinuing eating spinach. I mean, it's so outside the realm of possibilities. Now, we do have some concerns to get to that other one that I mentioned first about kidney stone formation. Like, let's say these oxalates are absorbed. Are they involved with people having kidney stones? And it turns out there's lots of different factors besides the oxalates in your diet. No surprise. I feel like we say this all the time with nutrition. There's lots of different factors that come into play that really determine whether or not somebody's going to get kidney stones. And this includes things like how hydrated are you, and what's your calcium intake, and whether or not you're absorbing fat correctly, and what's your vitamin C intake, and even what your composition of your gut microbiota is. All of these can play a role relative to your dietary oxalate intake, such that we don't want to look at just your oxalates to say, like, okay, this person's going to get kidney stone, because what we find is that diets that are high in oxalate have a decreased risk. In fact, high dietary oxalates decreases your risk of kidney stone formation by 50%. And it kind of makes sense. Like, remember all of the foods that I mentioned are high in oxalates: spinach, Swiss chard, beet greens. Like, we don't have all of these health issues in modern day society because we're eating too much Swiss chard. It's just like, I don't think that's the problem, right? The last thing I want to touch on is just the idea of how the oxalates could potentially prevent absorption in the GI tract. So this is before the oxalates would be absorbed, and, that they bind to calcium in the GI tract. Generally, the source of oxalates are not a great source of calcium. So if you're getting calcium in your diet from dairy, which is quite a good source of calcium, you really don't need to worry about how these oxalates might be binding or prohibiting the absorption of the calcium in the spinach, because you're going to get enough calcium from other sources in your diet. Now, we could make up a really extreme example. Maybe you already have osteoporosis. Maybe you don't eat dairy, you don't supplement, and all you do is eat spinach. Now we might be in a scenario where, okay, we actually have to start worrying about what these oxalates might be doing relative to calcium absorption. But think about all those steps that I just went through to kind of come up with that. Like, sometimes we start to worry about some extreme situations which are just not reality. There's a lot of things that go away when we don't try to eat in an extreme way.
Got it. Okay. Moving on to phytates.
Okay.
What do we need to know?
Yeah. I think we're going to stay a little high level on these next few ones, because I think our audience, probably can see the writing on the wall about how these are going to go. But phytates are common in plant foods. They actually serve as a storage place for the phosphate molecule. And the structure of phytates is such that they tightly bind to minerals, so kind of sounds a little bit like oxalates, and that they have the potential to reduce the absorption of these minerals. And in the case of phytates, we tend to start to worry about zinc and zinc absorption. But that really is only going to come to be a real concern or a dietary factor in very low income developing countries where the diet is primarily grains and legumes. And so again, this is kind of like coming up with a scenario that I would say is irrelevant to our listeners anyway. Even vegetarians and vegans who might have a good amount of grains and legumes relative to meat eaters, they still are going to have fruits, vegetables, nuts, seeds, tofu, such that they're going to make up zinc from these other sources. Again, so many things go right in the diet when we don't have to eat in a very extreme way. And then what's interesting about phytates is, similar to lectins, is that they have the potential to be beneficial, not harmful. We find that phytates might actually have an antioxidant property, potentially protecting the cells of the colon during digestion, and potentially protecting the cells of the colon from iron-induced damage, which we talked about in our Meat and Cancer Risk podcast. And so much earlier when I was talking about the lectins, I mentioned that whole grains reduces cancer risk, including colon cancer risk. This potentially could be part of the mechanism, that potentially phytates in these grains are actually part of the protective mechanism of them specific to cancer. So once again, we have a compound that people have suggested are harmful, but might actually be quite beneficial for us in a mixed, varied whole food diet.
Super interesting. All right, the fourth one is goitrogens.
Goitrogens is a term used to describe compounds that interfere with thyroid function. So it could then increase the risk of goiter, which just refers to your thyroid gland becoming enlarged, or maybe it increases the risk of just other thyroid diseases. And the compound's called glucosinolates, primarily in brassica vegetables, which are like kale and Brussels sprouts and cabbage and turnip greens and broccoli. These are going to be our dietary goitrogens. And what's interesting is that once these compounds are broken down in the body, they're actually known for their anti-cancer effect. So similarly, it's like people are saying that they're harmful, but then we also know some really helpful properties of them. And whether or not these goitrogens actually result in any thyroid issues really comes down to if people are having a very low iodine diet. So iodine is a trace element, very essential for thyroid production, and potentially large amounts of these dietary goitrogens might interfere with our ability to absorb and use iodine. Now, most of us in the US are getting plenty of iodine. And that's because we use iodized salt. That was how we got around iodine deficiency. And so we're not at the risk of this really being an issue. Now, could it be an issue? Potentially, if someone tries to, quote, really clean up their diet, they never used any processed foods, they're not exposed to iodized salt, and they only use like Himalayan pink salt or something like that. But again, most of us aren't there, so this is a non-issue. We're getting enough iodine such that we need to be eating more broccoli, more cabbage, more turnip greens, not eating less of them.
Okay, last one was phytoestrogens.
Yeah.
What are they? What do we need to know?
These are compounds in plants that have a similar structure to estrogen. And primarily it's soy that we think about that are very high in phytoestrogens. Other plants have phytoestrogens, but soy definitely has the highest amount. And the type of phytoestrogens that soy have are compounds called isoflavones. And under experiment conditions like cell studies or like animal studies, we found that, these phytoestrogens really do mimic the action of regular estrogen. And so the concern was, okay, is soy intake maybe involved in something like breast cancer, especially, right? Common disease, increasing incidence we find of breast cancer, what could possibly be in our diet that's affecting this risk? And so I think it was a really smart, logical concern to take a closer look at. But it's the same weaknesses that we've kind of discussed before, that looking at one compound in isolation in these experimental conditions has not translated to what we find in humans in whole diets. And we actually find that soy intake reduces the risk of breast cancer, and it even reduces the risk of breast cancer for women who had breast cancer and reduces the risk of reoccurrence. And some of the reason why we think that this soy consumption might decrease breast cancer risk is because these compounds mimic or kind of look like estrogen, that it could actually block the effect of our endogenous or our own body's estrogen. And so that might be why they're able to reduce the breast cancer risk overall. Now, sometimes we take things to extremes. This is not saying that you should go out and supplement with isoflavones, which do exist. This is not saying you should start taking high doses of isoflavones because we think they're beneficial. What this is saying is that including foods in your diet that have soy or that are soy, edamame, soy milk, tofu, these can be regular parts of your diet and they are quite healthy. And also, we'll put a link in the show notes. We have an old podcast, Quick Bite, that talks about how soy doesn't raise estrogen levels in men either, which is a fear out there as well. But again, just another example of where people have feared these compounds, yet in a mixed, varied whole food diet, they are quite healthy.
Got it. Okay, so shocker, we should still eat vegetables, regardless of these quote-unquote anti-nutrients. Good to know. And not a surprise at all that that's the
right. Surprise, surprise.
Yeah, right. So maybe let's zoom out, and any other big takeaways from just you're looking at these anti-nutrients, maybe not specifically nutrient by nutrient, but just high level. Any other takeaways you've got for us?
Yeah, I was really thinking about that one principle of mine that's never one thing. And I think I kind of hinted at it already when I was talking about kidney stone formation. There's all these factors besides oxalate that come into play if whether or not somebody's going to have kidney stones. But I think it's really useful to think about from a nutrition point of view. It's important that we don't just take one compound out of thousands in a plant and then extrapolate to what's going to happen when we eat that whole plant. Because when we eat that whole plant, there's going to be the effect of all of these different compounds such that there might be compounds that actually interact with that one to block its action. So the net effect is a positive one for us. And so this is actually what's really hard about nutrition, is that we try to figure out what exactly is driving what. But as we continue to get more evidence, we continue to think that it's the collection of everything that's driving it. It's not any single one molecule within it. And so the idea that it's never one thing is good to remind yourself, even within a food, that if you're isolating it down to a compound, you've probably missed the bigger picture of what's happening when you eat that food. And then to take that a step further, it's never one thing when we look at the whole diet. Like, again, no one listening to this podcast is just eating rice or just eating wheat for their whole diet. So it's not just the combination of the different molecules and bioactive compounds within broccoli. It's then also looking, okay, now we have meat, and now we have dairy, and now we have beans, and now we have fruit. And so this is why it's so important that we make sure we're looking at what happens when humans eat, not inject, eat that food as the food in a whole diet that would appear in a realistic scenario, so that we get a real understanding of risk and benefit.
Yeah. Thinking about the lectin idea again, where I've heard it, and I've actually heard somebody talking about it recently, and I don't remember what they were referencing, but they were like, I read it in a book that plants do this thing, and that's why blah, blah, blah. And so I bring that up just to ask the question of how are we supposed to navigate these kinds of things, right? Because there's all sorts of people with doctor at the beginning of the name or MD at the end saying, hey, don't do this, avoid this because of X, and don't do this because of Y, carnivore, et cetera, et cetera. How do we navigate this? How do we know what's real, what's not real, what to believe, what to listen to, what to do something with?
I wish I had some great answers. I think we've talked a little bit, like, I believe stay away from people that are fear-mongering.
Yeah.
Right? I think that's a good one. I think also if they really think they have something secret or way different and they can't acknowledge that any other approach works, I think that's kind of a red flag. Yeah, specific to this, I think this one you're going to smile at, but I have found it to be true. I find that the people who don't really cite PubMed references generally don't have the research to back it up. And I've actually found this now with books, that if the books don't have the reference right after they make a strong statement and they just put all of the references at the end, it's actually a pretty good screen for whether or not it's really well researched or not. And I find this is true with social media as well. Like, they'll say just studies show and they're real, but there's never a PMID number that follows. Yet the people that are really strong in the science and that I follow, they all have it. Now, I know as a layperson, it's very easy to see those numbers and just be like, oh gosh, it's just noise. But from a layperson perspective, I think it's not a perfect system, but it's a pretty good system. And it's interesting. I was just listening to Simon Sinek on a podcast, and he was talking about how people just really respond to both emotion and stories. And that's how we get hooked on some of this stuff. We get hooked on all of this fear-mongering. And he was saying how we don't really care as much about the explanations, or that doesn't really resonate with us. But yet that's really one of our great screens for better information. Are you hooked on the story? Are you hooked on the emotion? Or maybe now are you actually looking for the scientific evidence? So that's one. It's not a perfect system. But then I think even too, just kind of staying with the theme of this podcast, is try to apply that principle of it's never one thing, right? Are they like drilling down to this one potential molecule and kind of blaming all of society's woes on, wheat gluten? I mean,
or glucose.
Right, or glucose, or if they take it down to kind of that sort of level, I think, try to reality check yourself a little bit and sort of be like, okay, let's pull back. Let's pull back and be like, okay, what does the food look like? How does this food show up in our diets? And try to draw a conclusion from that.
Thank you. All right. Well, thank you as always for cutting through the noise for us and with us. Thank you everybody out there for listening. Thanks for your ratings and your reviews. EC and I will be back next week for a new episode of the Consistency Project podcast.